Okay, and now that we're probably like halfway done with this video already because potassium is so important and I took forever on it, we're moving on to probably the second most important, electrolyte if you're a nursing student, and that is sodium. So again, it's part of the same like sodium potassium pump. So a lot of it's the same, issues, but sodium's got a bit of a different focus if you're a nursing student other than potassium. So for sodium, we are looking at a blood serum concentration of 135 to 145. So I'm going to put that here. 135 to 145 milliequivalents per liter. And sometimes it just helps to say things in a funny accent while you write them. That is a habit that I have continued from nursing school and is very embarrassing, but it is more entertaining and it helps me remember maybe better, I hope. Okay, so for sodium, we know it's part of the sodium potassium pump. Let's go through our overview of sodium as an electrolyte and kind of see what we think is the most important just as an overview. So we got the value, 135 to 145. Actually, in my textbook, it says 136, but I remember 135 better, so I'm going to write that down. So it's saying keeping the difference in sodium levels is vital for skeletal muscle contraction, cardiac contraction, and nerve impulse transmission. So already it's telling us the most important thing from this chapter that we're going to look at is our muscles, again, skeletal and cardiac, it told us, and nerve impulse transmission and nerves. So again, sodium potassium pump, muscles, nerves. We got it. All right. Sodium levels and movement influence water balance because where sodium goes, water follows. That is a quote from the book that I am just going to put in here. Where sodium goes, so where salt goes, water follows. This is going to be like the theme of sodium. Where sodium goes, water follows. That's our overarching theme. So if we're thinking about where sodium goes, water follows. Okay, what this is saying is where we have a higher concentration of sodium, water is going to go there. So that's the case unless, our body is actively trying to hold on to one or the other. And they can do that a couple of ways. So we have hormones that regulate this process. And so talking about these hormones, we have antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and I'm going to put this one with, together with natriuretic peptide because they pretty much do the same thing. And the thing that they do is together, they work to increase the removal of sodium and the reabsorption of water. So ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and natriuretic peptide, they increase the removal of sodium, so they decrease our body concentration of sodium because they're removing it, and they help body reabsorb water, so they help the body hold on to water. And then we have another hormone that does the opposite of these two, and that is aldosterone. And this one helps the body increase sodium levels. Helps the body and get rid of water. So just an important fact. Where sodium goes, salt follows, but our body kind of helps compensate for that by using these hormones that hold on to specific things. Okay, so now that we got that nice little overview, let's move on to the problem. So this is our normal, let's move on to our problem children. So our first problem I'm going to start off with is, I don't know why I'm singing, guys. I'm sorry. Is that weird? I'm sorry, guys. Okay, so low sodium. It's called hypo, which means low. Natremia. Natremia. Did I even spell it right? Guys, I'm sorry. Okay, I did spell it right. Natremia, because sodium, the abbreviation is Na. So that's why. Hyponatremia, low sodium, Na. Okay. So low sodium is when we're below that 135. And what it is going to look like. I know you can cheat and see all this. But let's start over from here, okay? And I can explain what that means. Okay. So we know, again, from our overview, that it affects muscle and nerves. So, and we also know that where sodium goes, water follows. So we're having low blood, we're having hyponatremia, which means low sodium, emia means in our blood, low serum sodium. So if there's less sodium in the blood, that means there's more sodium comparatively in our cellular fluid, okay? So if we remember that where salt goes, water follows, and we're saying that that salt is, the concentration is a higher in our cells instead of our blood, that means we have water following that sodium into our cells. So the water is following the sodium into our cells, and that is creating a lot of problems. Because think about where the highest problem is going to be when you're talking about cellular swelling. And that, my friends, is in the brain. So when you think of sodium, you think of swelling, and you think of the brain. Hyponatremia. Low sodium, I'm thinking it's in our cells, and I'm thinking the brain. In our textbooks, it says cerebral changes, which means changes to our brain, are the most obvious problem of hyponatremia. So we can notice behavioral changes and increased intracranial pressure. Again, increased pressure because it's swelling and your brain is confined, by our skull. So if it's swelling in this confined space, we're having that increased intracranial pressure. So we're going to be aware of their, behavioral level of consciousness and mental status. And we could even see, some confusion in our older adults especially. And then when they're critically low, we can see seizures, coma, and death. So that is crazy important. I'm going to write that down. So we can see increased ICP, seizures, coma, death. Like, these are bad things. These should all go in our critical patient synopsis, right? So neuromuscular changes, it's not just seen in the brain. The brain problem, I think that's mostly because of the swelling issue. But if you think about the sodium's part in the sodium potassium pump, we also have the nerve excitability issues. So we're not just going to see the effect in the brain from the swelling, we're going to see effect in the nerves from that change of action potential and the change in those chemical reactions. Okay, so neuromuscular changes we're going to see as general muscle weakness. So I'm going to draw my little weak, sad muscles again. They're weak and sad because they're straight lines. They're not big and bulky. So sad. Sad muscles, they're weak. So we might have decreased, reflexes, muscle weakness. Oh, but this one's different. Muscle weakness is worse in the legs and arms. And so we're going to have the same problem that we had with the potassium. If we're having those sad, weak muscles, they're at a fall risk. So that's going to be an important thing too. Intestinal changes. So similar, it's a muscle. Increased motility, nausea, diarrhea, abdominal cramping. So I'm going to go ahead and draw them having a sad time with their digestive issue. It's going crazy. So cardiovascular changes, that makes sense. So where where sodium goes, water follows, and water is following sodium into the cells. That means we have a lower blood volume, which means we're going to see cardiovascular changes. So if we have low blood volume, we're going to have rapid, weak, thready pulse. That low blood volume, we could, be difficult to palpate our pulses. We're going to have that decreased blood pressure, and we're going to have that orthostatic hypotension. So I'm going to write that down because that's important. So we're going to have decreased blood volume, just blood V, and so decreased blood pressure. And I don't know how really I want to draw that, so I'm going to leave that up to you guys because I feel like I got the main important point for me. But if you can think of something creative, you go ahead and draw it on yours. And go ahead and share with everyone else. If everyone wants to put like a hashtag NSF Doodlebook, you can share all of what you draw online, and I think that would help your other fellow students. But okay, moving on. Oh, but sometimes that's not just the case. Sometimes we have low sodium in comparison to water because we are so full of water that we are diluting our blood to the point where our sodium looks like it's low. Okay, so if that's the case, it's gonna look a little different. So this is gonna be low blood volume when it's just hyponatremia, right? But if it's a problem associated with a fluid volume overload, that's a different thing, and we'll go on into that probably in the next page to look at that, okay? So stay with me. We're going to talk about that one a little bit later. All right, so we know it's a problem. We know we can have some pretty severe, like neurologically related, problems. We have that fall risk. We have the decreased blood pressure as also a fall risk when we have a fluid volume deficit. Let's move on to how we are going to treat it. So most of what we're going to do when we have low sodium is we're going to focus on, not overdoing it because it's possible to go from low sodium to suddenly we give them a bunch of sodium and now they have too much fluid and too much sodium, and then we've got the opposite problem. So drug therapy includes, we're going to try and get rid of drugs that cause us to lose sodium. So if they're on like diuretics, we're going to decrease their dose, so decreased diuretic loose. And if they don't have enough fluid, we can give them some IV saline. When you start talking with an accent, suddenly every word you say sounds wrong. And that's when we have fluid deficit. But if we have too much fluid and we don't want to give them any more, what we can do is give them a drug that helps get rid of the water and not the sodium. So that drug is called conivaptan. Or tolvaptan. Okay. And like I said, those get rid of water. So Connie and Tolva, they decrease water for when we're in fluid overload. Okay. Oops, sorry. And so when we give these, we're just going to keep monitoring. I think the main thing is to make sure we don't end up messing it up. Make sure we don't overdo it. We don't want to give them hypernatremia because we overdid it and gave them, too much saline or too much, or got rid of too much fluid. So we don't want to overdo it. All right, so that is it for low sodium. Let's move on to high sodium, hypernatremia. Why is that a problem? Let's find out. Okay. So I don't have to do my cards anymore. I can do it on here. Sweet. Okay. Oh, let me adjust my camera. All right, so for hypernatremia. I'm sorry, that's crooked. Okay. All right, hypernatremia. It's the same thing. Natremia is Na. Na, hyper means high. So hypernatremia. So what are we looking at with hypernatremia? So it's when it's greater than 145 and there's more sodium. And what it's saying is there's more sodium present to move across the cell membranes during depolarization, making excitable tissues more easily excited. So I'm sensing we're probably going to have this firework effect again. We're having super hyperactive, excitable tissue. Okay, so we got that. So, in addition though, water moves from the cells into the extracellular fluid to try and, dilute it a bit and kind of make up for that and compensate. So it's going to so we're going to see some shrinking in our cells. So I guess I can draw a cell here. That's what I'm going to do. And in hypernatremia, there's a lot of sodium in the blood. So I'm going to draw my sodium in the blood. That water is going to want to go from this cell to kind of even it out. It's going to go out and shrink the cell. Whereas in hyponatremia, we got like nothing out here, and we got a higher concentration in our cells. So water is going to want to move in, and that's where we get like the super swollen, so super swole. And this one's going to be like super skinny. Okay, so that's my visual. If we got the visual down. Can y'all see that actually? I don't know if you can see that. I think you can see it now. Okay. So the changes we see here are pretty similar actually. So our nervous system changes start with altered cerebral function, a different mental status, different attention span, cognitive function. They may have a short attention span, be agitated or confused. But if it occurs because of too much fluids, they can be lethargic, drowsy, stuporous, and even comatose. So we can have the same like neurological problems that we had from hyponatremia. For sodium, the biggest problem is with our brain for the most part. The problem with it in hypernatremia is more so that the cells are kind of dehydrated in our brain. And we all know when we're dehydrated, we feel a little weird and we don't think as fast and our attention span's not as good. And we, want to fix that. So our cells have literally shrunk in our brain, and that is causing problems because they're dehydrated. And so that can cause, an altered mental state, some confusion. It can be so they are shrunk. Sad. And then also it can occur, but we can also have neurological changes when we have hypernatremia and have too much fluid. So even if we have fluid overload and hypernatremia, we can have some serious side effects like lethargy, drowsiness, stuporous, and even comatose. So I'm just going to write coma because that's the most severe. Because, worst case scenario is probably the best thing to study in nursing school. So if we have hypernatremia without fluid overload, we still have like this shrunken, dehydrated brain that's going to cause us some confusion. If we have hypernatremia with fluid overload, that's when it gets worse and we can have lethargy and coma sort of thing. Okay, so that distinction is made. And then skeletal muscle changes can include twitching, irregular muscle contractions, and as it gets worse, it's the same, firework effect. They run out of gas and they're less able to respond, and then they get weak. So I'm going to draw my little firework effect again because that seems to be the most accurate way to really quickly remember this. So that's our sensation. Cardiovascular changes. We have some heart changes. They include decreased contractility because high sodium levels slow the movement of calcium into the heart cells. So that changes the way they're able to move that action potential, changes the way they're able to contract. which means we slow down the heart. So measure blood pressure and the rate and quality of the apical and peripheral pulses. I'm going to write down decreased contractility. And then our other changes, again, it's different. I'm going to go ahead, actually, I didn't do this. But if we have decreased water, like fluid, with decreased water, and increased water, like fluid overload. So again, we have the dehydrated cells. Neurologically that's affected versus the lethargy and coma. Lethargy, coma. And then it's saying that there's a difference also with blood pressure, which makes perfect sense. We're dealing with fluids, our body fluids. So if we have fluid deficit, we're going to have less blood pressure. Decreased BP, which is going to present itself as like thready pulse, all those common things. And then if we have increased fluid overload, we're going to have increased blood pressure and like the bounding pulse and all of that. So what can we do when we have too much sodium? Again, it depends. So if we have a fluid deficit and that's what's causing us to have too much sodium in our blood because we just don't have enough water to dilute it, what we're going to do is we're going to give them some kind of IV fluid or like some kind of fluid. So we're going to interventions. Oh, I'm making intervention. But if we have too much sodium, not enough fluids, what we're going to do is we're going to increase fluids in comparison. Increase fluids. So that's like IV, orally, it doesn't matter. We're just going to try and increase fluids. And so we can use fluids that don't contain salt, like, dextrose, lactated ringers, stuff like that. And then if we have fluid overload and hypernatremia, we can just get rid of all of that and give him a diuretic. So diuretic, let's just get rid of all of it. And so these are really our only interventions for too much sodium. So we're going to keep an eye on them though, just like the same thing for hyponatremia, that we don't end up going the other way. Like if we're treating hypernatremia, we don't want to give them a diuretic and then like keep them like fluid restricted or something and like get them super, super low on sodium. Like we don't want to do that. So we're going to just keep an eye on them and monitor it and make sure that we don't go the wrong way. Okay. And then we have our last little overview. Yes. Okay. So sodium, 135 to 145. Fluid balance is key. Again, we saw that in the way that it presents differently for if they have fluid deficit or fluid excess. Fluid deficit, we're going to see that low blood pressure, that low, thready pulse. Fluid overload, we're going to see that, we have the bounding pulse. And for both of them, it's going to change what drug therapy we use. Are we going to be able to give them diuretics or are we not? So, okay. So, I'm not going to read over this. You can take a picture and look at this because I don't want to be like the professors who just read off the slides because I complained about them and that would make me a hypocrite. So take a picture of that if you want it. Those are the causes. You can look in your book. Moving on. Yay!